Okay. All right. Little thing, I got my computer back. Yay! And they allowed me to return the other one. Ah, yay! So it didn't have that much of an expense. Flip side of it, I just got locked out of the system. So just got locked out. I'm going to have to get locked back in. I got caught up to a certain point with grades, and I think that I have taken care of some of the problems up to a certain point. But just so you know, okay? I'll be dealing with that probably tomorrow. All right, so some interesting readings. Had the film, right? Great film. Lots of stuff going on in Kenya right now, even to relating to this case, right? So if you look, there's a couple of links here, right? All up to the fall, right? So honey at the top, something about that. Forced people evictions, still with the World Bank support, as we just talked about. Finland, surprising because they're typically a little bit more enlightened in these areas, or claim to be, right? Okay, and this link, how many people went to this? Did anybody go to this? Let's check this out. This is an incredible thing, and it's becoming more and more popular. Not specifically this program, but we've been making new programs. There's one called Forest Watch. Hold on, let me find it. Forest Watch. Forest Watch phone app. See if we can get it now. Forest Watcher. I think that's right. Yes. Okay. Here's an example. Check this out, right? We've got these smartphones. They should be smart for something, right? So now we can get our maps of whatever kind of territory you want to talk about, be it the Mayagna maps. They've got them. They can bring them in on their phones, right? We can do the same for others, make it even public under the Creative Commons, right? And then we've got this app that we can use to make alerts. We saw somebody poaching. We saw somebody coming out with all of our logs, right? So this is something that we've been using for this exact case that you're talking about. This is called Timby. Okay, so this is another program. Let's go and check this out. All right, report, investigate, share. Have you ever heard of this one? Anybody ever heard of it? It's being used all over the place, like really all over the place, not just Africa, but also the United States and other kinds of things. So this is my backyard. Anybody ever heard of NIMBY? You ever heard of that? What does that mean? Not in my backyard, right? This is the comment. I don't want a garbage place right in my backyard, so we argue against having the city install a garbage place, right? This is the opposite, right? This is my backyard, and I want to take care of it, and that means I need to be keeping track of any kinds of problems, right? So they've got, there's your usage globally, right? And we've got maybe a little bit of an example right here about, here's an image, a video, audio, and gallery that you can report. The thing about this is that if you look in the news on the environmental front, you've got activists, right, all around the world. What are you hearing about environmental activists around the world? What's the buzz about all the environmental activists? There's a theme in the news. What's happening to them? Do you know? Not just like the United States, I'm thinking other places, especially third world places. We've got a lot of environmental activists. They're very, very active, and something's happening to every one of them. All the top ones in every country, it's happening. What do you think? Yeah, gone, shot, killed, missing, kidnapped, you name it, right? So because of that, everything that we do on our phones and what we're traceable for can be hacked or looked into or taken if we're kidnapped, right? I've been lightly kidnapped. Right? They commandeered our boat and said, we're taking you, and went upriver, and we said, well, that's good because we're going there, and guess what we're working on? Indigenous land rights. And they said, oh, really? Well, come along, right? Thank goodness, right? Okay, but these messages now are encrypted with some of the strongest encryption So you can't get into what we're documenting, and it gets uploaded instantly into a system that we can manage, right? Like, let's say I was working on some kind of a project right now, and I wanted to make it super secure and by necessity, right? And get real-time data that was being sent to me. Difficult to get it on email, right? We've got Skype, nah, that's way open. WhatsApp, we've talked about. Signal, yeah, okay, but it's all hackable eventually, right? So now we've got this new system that can protect the people that are raising the voice to protect the lands, also protect their data to make sure it gets somewhere, right? And make it easier for all of us, right? So it's becoming more and more common. So very, very interesting news that they're talking about all this, okay? So also another one in the fall. Everybody heard of Manga Bay? You ever heard of this? They have some of the most amazing news pieces on environmental and cultural things around the world. I recommend it, right? So coming together and talking as a community, right, in terms of what we need to do to protect hunter and gather rights, existence rights, and the like, okay? Now, one of the things that we experienced with the Mayagna was a declaration of the area, the lands, as a park. Remember, we talked about it being called a park, right? Okay. And it was designated under the United Nations. Yay! Lots of money, right? They can help us protect this. Should be, right? Lots of offices all over the world, right? And they have a group called UNESCO, right? You remember talking about UNESCO? Okay, it's about education, society, culture, protecting sacred sites all around the world, right? So UNESCO came forth and they said, we've got this program that's called Man in the Biosphere. Have we talked about this yet? Man in the Biosphere? Right. Okay. And they said, we're going to declare this park Man in the Biosphere Park because there's lots of people in it, right? They first looked into it and they said, let's just move everybody out of there. Then we can protect it. And then we said, no, are you kidding? They thought there were like maybe 3,000, 4,000 people there. No. There's 40,000 Mayagna. If you incorporate the buffer zone, it's like 150,000 people altogether, right? I didn't incorporate the Miskitu or anybody else. A lot of people there. Unbelievable. So UNESCO declared it a park, and that means if it's something beneficial, right? The country gets money, they get support. Ideally, we get support for the forest guards. Didn't quite make it all the way, but that's the idea, okay? And in the process, they hold meetings with us. They say, we want to make sure you adhere to the policies of UNESCO, right? So they held a meeting with us. They had to get everybody there, including women, right? So they trucked everybody there. It was an awful experience because they didn't get there until very, very late. It was pouring down rain. There were no accommodations for them. They didn't tell them that they needed accommodations. So they arrived. There's nothing to sleep on. It was pouring rain. And it was about 1 o'clock in the evening or in the morning, right? No food outside of crackers and juice. So a little bit of a miscommunication was our experience, right? This was the attempt to get them a voice or a seat at the table or, right, consensus or consent. Say, we got to talk about what's going on in the park. So the next morning when we all woke up and everybody was in a frightful mood because we didn't even have coffee, right? What were they thinking? I don't know, right? They came and arrived to give us our lectures, and the first thing they gave us was a packet of information. On it was a map of new military installations they were going to put in. This was their ability to make sure all the community members were adhering to the rules of the park. Remember, this is parklands that were just legally titled completely into their hands as inalienable, non-abilities to sell, right? And theirs in a certain sovereign kind of sense, okay? And then we came in and told them what their rules were, right? And we're putting in military installations. Among the rules were, if you want to cut down a tree, many do to make their homes and the like, you got to come into Managua and ask for a permit. For some, that was a full boat ride for a full day, and then 2 days bus ride, right? Remember the annual income, about $800, right? So for the indigenous people, basically UNESCO was laying down rules, and rules that nobody could keep to, right? Do we remember the tragedy of the commons? What happens? One person does what? Brings an extra animal, puts it on the commons, and what's the impact for everybody else? Everybody else goes, "Oh, look at that! I wouldn't have done that. Look at that!" Do they chime in and do the same thing? They do, right? That's what we're saying. That everybody else is going to violate the rules. So we just got some tough rules from UNESCO, and everybody's probably going to violate them. Both sides, right? Potentially, Ali income free, come and get all the stuff before it's gone, right? And we're talking about trees. Not only trees, but also the source of medicines and one of the largest sources of carbon intake, right? Largest broadleaf rainforest north of the Amazon, right? So we've got a lot of things going on, and we've got a lot of rules, and we've got a lot of people trying to survive off the land. We said 73% they depended on the land. And then we just told them they had to come in for a permit to get a log cut down or hunt an animal. It's like, wow. Okay, so very much our experience too in Nicaragua, what you saw in Kenya, right? Anybody heard of other cases like this around the world? A lot like this going on in Australia, everywhere, really. Okay. All right. So, any other comments about the film? All right. So just kind of a review as to where we've been. We talked about ethnocentrism, talked about relativism, right? At the very beginning of the semester. And then we went into talking about colonialism and how world systems really kind of developed from that colonialism, right? When we look today at how the World Bank is managed, it's pretty easy to see that those countries that are most manipulated or coerced were the ones that received that colonial threat, and maybe declared independence only more recently. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about the value of nature, right? We talked about the value of certain cultures for medicine, right? We also talked about intellectual knowledge, right? And how it's developed over generation, passed on to generation, passed down to generation. And even their language is critical to that, right? This year is the year of the language for the United Nations, honoring the fact that those languages really encode our critical knowledge about the environment, that adaptive knowledge, okay? So the importance of their existence on the land, right, to continue that knowledge and stand up for their rights and provide yet another diverse culture in the world, right? We said that that diversity was important for our survival, adaptation, and future, okay? So going from there, we have to say that, you know, there are 370 million indigenous people. We said they were second largest minority. We said the first was women, which is weird, I know. But we also said they're on the front lines of our environment. They're on the front lines of our biological hotspots. They're critical to what's happening. And in fact, if we go into some of these measurements from GIS and satellite imagery, we'd see, as the Mayagna say, they're beneficial to the environment, or it's green because of them, right? Now, we can have some arguments about that. What might be some of our arguments? Could be that, oh, I don't know, they were affected by war. What do you think about that? 10 years of war maybe had some kind of an impact on how much they took out of the rainforest? Maybe. Okay. We could also say, oh, maybe some groups just don't have an impact because they've got a low population density, and that's just the way it is, right? Okay. Right. So we can't be romantic about the notion, okay, but we can still take a look and see what their practices are, how they manage their land, and why, and a little look into their knowledge to understand that maybe this group might be very, very good at protecting our critical environment, okay? So for that, we've come up with this issue of, how do we justify supporting Indigenous people? And it's an absurd question to some people like me, right? How do we justify the rights of Indigenous people in the world? And it's a strange thought. Think about it for a minute, right? Yeah, you've got rights as human beings, so do we all. But we're calling a special group having special rights. We did the same thing to child soldiers. Anybody know about that? You remember child soldiers? You remember Coney, the Coney film, right? So we have a special group of kids that weren't being assisted in the world, and they were getting horrible, horrible experiences, right? Kidnapped into conflict. And then when they come home, the family, even their own, says, oh my gosh, you've been trained to kill. Not only that, you killed people we knew. Ah, shame on you. And these poor kids are shunned from their communities, right? UNESCO found them banging their heads, or UNICEF found them banging their heads up against the wall just because they couldn't handle who they had become, right? So we took a special group out of the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and we said, let's make sure that we take care of these people, because we just can't handle as a world the idea that young kids are abducted into conflict and then pretty much thrown away, right? So same thing with Indigenous people. We think that they deserve a special protection. In fact, we got them set up. They have their own human rights section under the UN, right? But part of that meant trying to figure out how to justify what was so special about keeping them up there in that level of importance. One was human diversity. It's important that we have all human cultures supported, alive, and in existence. Let's make sure that we don't lose any human cultures. That's human adaptation and the interest of diversity, right? Then we came back and we said, gosh darn it, if you look at it in comparison to all of our scientists with the white coats and everything up in our ivory tower as we are, we noticed that the difference of knowledge of the environment is extreme, right? Even encoded into special parts of their language. Remember we talked about the O'oputero? Do you remember that conversation? Do you remember talking about the O'opu? Well, let's have that conversation, right? So salmon, we have salmon, right? And we know salmon, they spawn up in the high mountains, right? And then they come down, and then they go back up and they spawn, right? Or is it the reverse? They give birth up there, right? And then they come down, they live their life. Okay, the O'opu are reverse, right? So they give birth down in the ocean brackish water, right? And then they go up the rivers. You know about this species? They're really cool. They have a little sucker right here on their chest, and they literally like climb up the rocks. It's wild stuff. It's not like the salmon ladders or whatever. But the thing about this fish is that it can exist in both saltwater and freshwater, right? So we have a term called O'opukalo. Kalo is the word for taro in the Hawaiian language. And in that name will tell you everything about how to grow it. Because we know the life cycle of the o'opu. And mind you, that's not a scientific name. This is the local name, the local native Hawaiian term. So if we're looking to the language of native Hawaiian language, we can see that there's a taro variety that's called o'opukalo. And the name actually refers to how you have to grow it, and that you've got to grow it in an area that's brackish water. Little bit fresh, little bit salt, right? And if we didn't know about the life cycle of the o'opu, or even what it was, we go, I don't know what that was, but cool plant, let's go plant it, and it wouldn't grow unless you went to the right place, right? So losing the language means we lose the meaning here, and it also loses the knowledge of the site-specific place that we've been developing over millennia, right? So we must, we think, defend the indigenous right to land. Not only is it what they survive on, but it appears our world environment is surviving off of them and their knowledge and how they care for the environment, right? In fact, we're even worried about our demand causing their care of the environment to be affected, right? Hardwoods and the like. Think about mahogany, cedar, and whatnot. So in terms of defending the right to land, it can be a complicated process, but we're going to go through it, okay? Because it's a pretty fascinating thing. And guess what? All kinds of amazing things are happening right now. Just in Arizona, I believe it's either Arizona or Texas. I'll check on the news. We had a new declaration of a government-to-government relationship. This is different than having treaty rights. This is a full respect of sovereignty, as if they are another sovereign nation that's been carved out of our land, as if it was an embassy, right? When we have embassies around the world, we call that our sovereign land, right? Which means we can do anything within it. It's ours sovereign-wise. We just arranged this government to government with one of our tribes, which means it's a legal precedent, which means everybody else can get on board and do similar things, okay? We also did something fascinating in Saboba. I don't know if you know about it. How many people know anything about Saboba? Any new thing you notice about Saboba that they've done? Okay, so they just established a brand new resort. How many people know about that? Nobody. Okay. There's some signs around that announce it. And in the establishment of the resort, they wanted to be able to build the resort in a specific place. And the county and the state and the federal government says, well, you can't build it there. That's your housing. It's not designated for a resort, right? And they said, well, we want to redesignate it. And say, well, then you're going to have to figure out where to put your housing. And Saboba says, well, we'd like to buy up new property. That's kind of interesting. My personal opinion, they shouldn't have to buy it, but whatever. It's been sold and people have it and it's been put into private property. So they went around and bought people's properties, farms, houses, right? All that were willing to sell. There were some that weren't, right? And they made an arrangement which is called fee to trust. Did we talk about that before? Okay, so fee simple is how most land is sold. We have this other category, but fee simple is where you can own something outright, sell it to whoever you want, right? Now, we also know that Native American lands are put into trust under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You know this, right? We've been talking a little bit about this, okay? So in this way, we are able to buy private property and put it into trust. This is a new thing. It means that we can enlarge the land that Native American tribes have. It's not common that we can do this. Usually it's shrunk. Now we can enlarge it. Yay! Right? Okay. Again, a new legal precedence, right? Just had, let's see if I can find this. I think it's Okay, I'm going to have to find this news another time. Okay, I believe we had a state back east that just agreed to announce that half of their lands are indigenous sovereign lands. Mind-blowing, right? That's another potential case that can do incredible things. The Navajo are also doing amazing things in this area as well. So, when we have issues with the lack of right to land, we can go to report that under the UN system, right? Now that we have this special group dedicated to indigenous people, okay? So we've got something called the UN DRIP, which we've talked about, right? Remember that in 2007 we had four countries that said, we don't think so. Which were they? 4 countries looked at the UN DRIP, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. They said, no way. Who were they? Talked about it maybe around the beginning of the semester. Let's try and come up with them. Who were they? Who were they? Who were they? Who was one of them at least, do you think? Canada was one. Yeah, Canada. Close to Canada, you have? Yes. Okay, so the US said, no way. All right, who else? Think Pacific, but keep going as far as you can. South. There you go, Australia. And next to them, in the news lately, awful things happening there. Just don't even know what to say about that. Okay, so these 4 countries, when we had the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People come up, nearly 35 years in draft, right? That's a long time. Think about that. 4 countries said no. 11 countries said, we'll see what happens, and they sat on the fence for a while. Nicaragua was one of them. So we'll see, right? There are still some that are sitting on the fence, right? But among these 4, we had all of them say they would endorse articles. Now, does that mean they signed? It means they only support certain articles, okay? And you'll see why, right? Unless you've already gone into it, okay? So typically that means that when we talk about indigenous rights with this group, the US will come in with a report and show how they've supported those articles, right? Bless you. Same thing with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, so they'll come in and give reports on how they're doing mostly. Okay. The United States has had one big, enormous, very publicized case about a violation of indigenous land rights. Are you aware of what it was? Recent, fairly recent. Take a guess. Yay, you got it right. Perfect. Okay, so we actually brought in the special reporter. They're called special reporters. So when you get some kind of terrible thing with human rights, you send an email to the special reporter, explain what's happened, and they say, wow, we're coming to investigate. And they let the country know, and the country says, all right, do what you will, right? Or maybe they don't say anything, or maybe they say, take a hike, right? And they come in when they're able to, and they interview everybody. So we had our special UN special rapporteur come in and interview everybody at the Dakota pipeline, right? You know that some pretty horrible things were happening there, including unleashing angry dogs on people. Brutal things that we saw even in the news, okay? So we have been reported and had a large case, bless you, all right? So I want to just reiterate a little bit about the colonial side before we get into the UN DRIP a little bit further, okay? Now, some people say that our reference to indigenous people as tribal groups might be a colonial construction, right? Others say we have to have some way of identifying them as clan groups, and many are distinguishable by clan groups. Like if you could look at the Mayagna as an example, they're distinguishable by clan groups that are even in different dialects of their Mayagna language. So the language is distinct, right? I found that out when I showed up with the dictionary and the grammar book and thought everything was fine. They said, wrong book, right? So we've also been very bad over time in terms of identifying ethnic groups, okay? And mixing ethnic groups, even to a point where we've made it difficult to deal with the legal issues. It is said that we still cannot deal with the ramifications of slavery for the African American population because we still don't want to deal with the issues about Native Americans. And you start to deal with one and it affects the other one as if they're linked. And instead, we don't want to deal with either, right? I mean, we have countries that have gone through how to pay back for what they've done, right? We have payments going back and forth between countries for mistakes made. And yet in our country, we haven't gotten to that level yet. Okay. Definitely an important issue when we look at what happened by 1914. Quite literally, 85% of our world was colonized by Europe. 85%, right? That's an enormous amount. Think about that, right? So that amount, including those that were the colonizers, really affected where we are today and where our arrangements are in terms of rights and land, okay? All right, so I want to remind you about terms that we use, a couple of important ones. This week is about governance and some of the concepts about governance. So we say in the UN DRIP that we're interested in self-determination. Heard this buzzword a lot lately, right? It's almost everywhere. Oh, self-determination, yay! Okay. Almost like the word empowerment. We got really into the word empowerment for a while there. Remember that one? Okay. So what we mean by this is we want you to be free to determine your own future. And as it relates to Indigenous people, we've written this in as a huge focus for the UN DRIP. We said, too often, our colonial system dictates how they have to behave. In fact, look at just the environmentalists. We tell them what they can hunt for their food, right? But what we really ought to do in terms of supporting their rights is to support their decision making. For some environmentalists, this is frightening, right? Remember what happened with Santa Marta when the federal government in Nicaragua said that they were going to take their lands and give them to a forest concession? Do you remember what happened? They lit their lands on fire. And they said, you want it now? No, right? We got this big fear that that's what's going to happen. So self-determination is one of our ideals, and yet we're just a little bit too afraid to let go of the reins. So you'll see our attempt continues to control. Remember, we talked about development and how we put certain monies in categories and we say, you can get this money if you do this, right? Okay. So self-determination. Autonomy. That's a tricky word. Okay. It means self-law. Auto, self, nomos, law. Okay. And the idea is, wow, Indigenous people ought to be able to have their own laws. Really. Yeah. And they do around the world. But oftentimes our nation states will kind of get in the way, right? But we have some strange examples where they have allowed autonomy to keep going, okay? One of the examples I remember well as a kid, where we had two teenagers come down to the Seattle area and they robbed an AM/PM. And I stole a bunch of money. I think the guy either died or was sent to the hospital, right? Shot or stabbed. I can't remember all the details. But they were from a tribe, the Tlingit, in Canada, and their argument was, we have autonomy. And we would like to be able to handle this problem with our citizens, even though it affected yours, with our traditions. And you should respect our autonomy. And we did, to a degree. Okay. So what happened was that they said, we're going to banish them. Weird, right? We said each one, they're going to have island. We'll give them a shelter. We'll give them a gun to hunt with and a knife to, whatever's necessary for them to survive. But they're going to be banished for punishment, right? And the government let them do it, right? Washington State allowed it. Said, yes, we'll stand behind. Okay. Now, over time, checking in on things, we found that the boys' family members, little by little, were coming onto the island and visiting and checking in on them and making sure they were okay and bringing supplies. Okay, so it wasn't working. And eventually, we had the state workers from Washington State go up and bring them in. They served 2 years, right? Was going to be 10. So kind of, we adjusted things, right? But that's an example of allowing for autonomy to take over for at least a little bit, right? Okay. Sovereignty. In Hawaii, we have oh, yes.
That's not always the case. Like, don't they look at where the crime is committed? Like in the U.S., how the crime
could have been in a different state. Oh, yes. Yes and no, because this was not tribal land. So this was public land. But each state is going to be different.
I know a lot like teaching race cases, they look like where it occurred or like if the person was part of the tribe or not, and like that determines who, like which court is in charge of determining the punishment.
Interesting. I'd have to, we should look into that further. Right. Yeah, you're right. Jurisdiction in terms of different cases and different kinds of cases. Yeah. Does that relate to the Canadian stuff as well?
I don't know.
So, because we know we have a big cases with missing women in Canada, so that's why I was thinking. And then it also has affected Minnesota and I want to say Wisconsin area as well, right? Because we've had some legislation even recently passed to that regard about clamping down on that. So that might be part of that, or it might not be. I'm not sure. I know there's a lot of problems with it, and it's not been fixed. So you're right. So in Hawaii, I say we have a lot of problem with this issue of sovereignty because a lot of times we've been talking about the Native Hawaiian Reorganization Act. Remember, we talked about the Akaka Bill, right? We talked about the apology resolution. We said, oh, we had this idea about becoming Native Americans. It's kind of an issue, right? In the process, there was this campaign to reinitiate the Native Hawaiian government. And they called it sovereign. They said this is about sovereignty, right? But sovereignty means that you have royal power and authority. And it also, to a degree, has to incorporate power on a global sense. Otherwise, we can just, right? How did we force Nicaragua to title the lands to the Mayagna in Awastigny's case? We did that, didn't we? Do you remember? What did we do? We threatened them. Do you remember? We told them we were going to take away their what? All their money. We had the World Bank go and say, yeah, we're taking care of about 70% of your annual spending, but if you don't title these lands to these indigenous people, we're gone, and we'll give you 30 days notice. Like, that would have just crippled the country. They had to. Okay, so sovereignty also has got this idea about power. So who has the power in Hawaii? Who has the biggest power in Hawaii? Power. Think power. Close. I'm thinking more military, right? So let's say Hawaii says, we've declared ourselves indigenous, we're a sovereign nation, we're autonomous, respect us. And we say, whatever, we've got all the battleships, right? We got all the guns. No way would the US government ever allow that to happen. And yet that has been the campaign that we've made. We want sovereignty. So it's been a confusing term over there because the way we've been using it there isn't really exactly what it means. Because what it means is really like, if I tell you to get out, and you do, right? Versus we can figure out some other way to manipulate you into behaving, okay? All right. So parts of history have given us some interesting entities in the world, right? We have something called the International Monetary Fund, huge amounts, billions of dollars, right? We just talked about UNICEF. Remember I told you when I got back from New York, how much does UNICEF manage on an annual basis every year in cash? How much? Do you remember? $3 billion cash every year. Oh, this is mind-blowing, right? That's just a small little podunk little UNICEF. Think about the World Bank. Think about the IMF, right? And we've got banks all over the place. Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, Middle Eastern Development Bank, all kinds of areas, regions, we have these kinds of development banks, okay? With a lot of funding and a lot of control and a lot of ability to coerce, just like what we did in Nicaragua, okay? So let's go to the United Nations, right? Kind of an interesting thing here with United Nations. They've got a lot of different things that they do at once, right? Right now, we've got a lot of what was going on. I think this is about Mozambique. No, this is Haiti. I'm sorry. We've got a lot of emergency things that they're dealing with here, right? Got a little bit on what it looks like in New York. They've got this little things that you can go visit. Nice award to the lady that was so good with math. Okay. Mozambique, right? What happened there? Okay, so we've got a lot of emergency things going on here, but wow, have you ever taken a look on this website before? How many people have looked at the UN websites before? Okay, good. Thank you for doing so. You'd be blowing your mind, I think, if you really went to look at all these different kinds of things. Check that out, internships, right? Victims of terror, terrorism, law, climate change, global issues. So they're pretty much into everything, right? And get more information about what they do. Okay, so we established the United Nations, the League of Nations first, but the United Nations with the idea that we need to assure that human rights are protected all around the world. And we don't get into any more of those awful things that we called world wars, right? This is war prevention. Then we established declarations over time of human rights, basic human rights. So you can go here, click on it, go check it out. What are our basic human rights, right? Protection of children, by example. And then we have this structure here. This is all part of the UN, right? How much of this do you understand and know? When we have a big, horrible thing that happens in the world, we can report violations to people, right? Once we decide, yeah, something horrible and awful is really going on, what do we do next? We try and open up a case or file a case against whoever's doing it. Maybe it's a dictator, by example, right? Rwanda. We did that with Rwanda, okay? Open up a case against a dictator. Now, we've got two different courts here. We've got the International Court of Justice, a lot more aligned with the UN General Assembly and whatnot, easier to bring in cases through that way. And then we've got the International Criminal Court, which is completely independent. Okay, and we can bring different cases or cases into both of these, right? Now, if you've signed on to some of our international accords, the International Criminal Court would pertain to you. And if you didn't, then you could effectively thumb your nose at the court. However, try and travel. What do I mean by that? Try and travel outside of your international borders, thumbing the nose at the ICC. What happens? They get arrested. It happens. Okay? They're considered war criminals and they get arrested, so travel doesn't happen, therefore. Okay? So that's a little bit about maintaining jurisdiction and things like that. All right. Let's go to the DRIP. Okay? Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Okay? I hope you all get the chance to read this, or already have. And I want you to, while you're reading it, go in and pick out your favorite articles. Okay? Read the articles. Because this is what we're saying the world needs to guarantee to Indigenous people. Right? Full enjoyment as individuals and protection as Indigenous people. Right? Right to self-determination. There it is. Yay! Okay? Now, Nicaragua has signed on this. And when we went to transfer legal title to the Indigenous people, do you remember what I said? Nicaragua says, we can't see you. Do you remember that? They said, we can't see you and we can't figure out what you look like because your tribal organization doesn't make sense to our laws. So you're going to have to organize like president, vice president, secretary, blah, 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 blah. And you need to elect them. Now, how did Nicaragua do with self-determination? Failed, right? Because their traditional structures are an elders council. So well known, if you're going to do any kind of activity on the Atlantic coast, you need to call up the elders council, the big overhead elders council, not just the community elder councils, but the big coordinating elders council. Everybody knows that. And yet, when we said we were going to recognize people, we said they had to look like this weird thing, kind of like a business, right? So, messed with that. Okay. All right, you see the word autonomy in here? We want to protect people's autonomy and tribal groups' autonomy. Right to life, okay, no genocide, right? This idea of genocide is a little bit difficult for us in the United States because with blood quantum laws, kind of talking about genocidal laws, right? Meaning, if all of our benefits are based on blood quantum and we know it's going to decrease, we're kind of actively decreasing the existence of the tribe or the group, right? So, not quite actually working very well there, right? I like number 8. Number 8's really interesting. No forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Interesting, huh? If we're going to sign this, this means that we're not going to actively try to destroy people's culture. I mean, take away their land, right? Take away their benefits or their ability to exist. Look at this one. Oh my goodness. We will not do any action that dispossesses people of their lands. We just did a year ago. Brand new one. Right? You think we're endorsing this article? Not so much. Okay. All right, let's see. Let's keep going. I think we want to go to number 26. Let's check out 26. Another one of my favorites. Okay. Indigenous people have the right to lands, territories, resources which they traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Oh, wow, that's a lot. Look at that. What would happen if we had the US federal government raise the gavel in a courtroom and slam it to the table and pronounce that we were going to accept and support this article? Think about it for a minute. What would happen? Our government would become what? Starts with a D. Thank you. Right? All of the land, right? I mean, essentially, we've got a myth that coordinates our country, remember? Says we're the people, our government is the government of the people, right? And essentially, to make it that way, they had to conquest. So to return all the lands would mean none left, right? What do you think about the words occupied or otherwise used or acquired? Huh? I mean, acquired even, like, wow, that's like new, right? New stuff. But a lot of the lands that they got, were they their traditional lands? Not so much, right? In fact, we gave them the worst of the lands, usually. Okay. Due respect to customs, land tenure, and the like. That means their rules we need to respect. Okay. And that might even mean that when they're talking about whales and counting the numbers and saying this many can be harvesting, we have to respect that, right? Sort of. I mean, that's what this is saying, okay? All right, so I hope you get the chance to read that and pick out your favorite article. I will ask you about that on the final exam, which your favorite one is. So please go do that this week. All right? Okay. Now, let's keep going. Decolonization. We talked a lot about colonization. We should be talking about decolonization, right? We said there were a few methods of decolonization, didn't we? Quite a lot of people working on decolonization, not just of land, but what? What else? Another buzzword these days, decolonization of the mind, right? We've created the kind of thinking that's a real colonial approach, even in terms of literature or media or ways things are expressed, right? So is it possible to decolonize? What kind of colonization are we talking about? Maybe we need to write the new narrative of what really what happened in this country, right? So if we did decolonize, wow, no telling what would happen. Okay. We just had billions of dollars being awarded to a group in Australia that were found to have been very, very damaged by the local government. Billions. That's also now a new legal international precedent, as was Awastingni. Return of nation-state lands, colonial, to the indigenous people themselves. Okay. Now, also in this whole process is what we call free, prior, informed consent. Has anybody heard of this before? Did we get to talking about this before? No. Okay. What does it mean? If you heard it or read it on a document, what would you think it meant? Okay. All parts. Pardon? No tricks, right? I should be able to be told everything that's going to happen. Shouldn't be any tricks. Maybe even the predictive future of what's going to happen too, right? Like you might be seen by others in this kind of a scenario if this is going to happen, right? So free, prior, informed consent. What does the word consent tell you? Okay. Does it tell you that the indigenous people came up with whatever it is? Or is it coming from the outside? Okay. So consent means that you're consenting to something that somebody else did, right? Informed, we get that we get what we want that to mean, like no tricks and even unforeseen, right? Prior to messing around with the pipeline, like we need to sit down and have a discussion with this, right? Not preempted later. And free, right? Like you should be inviting all of us. We should all be able to get there. It should be free. If we can't get there, you should pay for it, right? So we say right now, you can look in the news, that our UN drip can be whittled all the way down to one little thing, and that is free prior informed consent. I find it really disturbing that we've said, out of all of our declarations of the rights of Indigenous people, it's really about their consent. Because it's reactive. Think about that. When we have declarations of rights, it's about declaring what our rights are. It's about claiming our rights that we already have, right? We already have the right to life. What we've done in declaring it is that we've declared our right, okay? So in making this declaration of rights, we've actually not really done that. We've just said, here's how you have to deal with us, with all of your stuff. It's not given them special rights. It's required us to get their permission for what we want to do. So it's a bit of a problem, okay? And there's some other aspects about it too. If you look at some of the definitions here, let's see if I can find the link. Just a moment. My goodness. Okay, there we go. All right. So we have some interesting things that happened. And we now have an international definition of Indigenous. We said we didn't really want to do it. Isn't that weird? We said we really didn't want to define Indigenous people internationally, but now we've got these things called rights. And now we have to figure out like who it pertains to. So here we go. Self-identification as Indigenous people. So as an Indigenous person, you say, I'm Indigenous, and we as a group have declared ourselves Indigenous. The Mayagna have done this. We found it strange that when they went to the National Assembly in Nicaragua, we had parliamentarians, you know what that means, right? People that have been voted into the National Assembly, parliamentarians that didn't even know who they were, thought that they had just passed on and died, and that the population had disappeared. So it was interesting that we had to really come into and organize in front of the National Assembly and say, we're here, right? Okay, we did this dance thing and showed some of their traditional stuff and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So we had to declare. Now, you've seen the Ainu declare just this last week, right? I mean, they've been at it for a number of years, but we looked at the news about the Ainu from Japan, and they have just effectively declared their Indigenous status. It was a local, national, in-house law that said these people are Indigenous, okay? Now, what was the weird thing about their law? Do you remember? I said it was still kind of assimilationist. Do you remember what was weird about it? How did it define Indigenous people? How did it define Ainu status? Only through the paternal line. And if you married somebody that wasn't Ainu, you instantly lost your status, right? Okay, so Japan went to self-identify, they declared themselves Indigenous, and yet the law that was written is still kind of a little bit colonial, right? I mean, they can lose their status. Okay. All right. Next one. Historical continuity. That means we've been there long time with pre-colonial and pre-settler societies. So pre-colonial, pre-settler is not really defined here, so it's confusing. But historical continuity, we get that. It means we've been here and we've never left. Even maybe a large portion left, but there were some that were still there. Okay? So some have still been there. Strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, right? This is really an interesting piece that we can document very, very well as anthropologists. Think about how we can document the cultural link to territories and the land around them. Just talked about the Oopu, didn't we? One of the things we did with the taro farmers was to have them make a list of all the varieties of taro, and then a list of all the plants they see on their land, birds they see on their land, right? And all of a sudden, I'm talking with them about their specific knowledge of specific varieties. That's how we came up with the Oopu. Yes, it still exists. Yes, they still know about it. And yes, they can tell you exactly how it's grown, okay? Because they preserved that knowledge. So again, linked to territories, we do this by documenting their link to territories. So yes, we map, but we also write down folk stories, right? One of the big core areas of conservation for the Mayagna is what they call the Waula zone. Did we talk about the Waula? Did we? It's a big anaconda with feathers all over. I feel like we did. We talked about the Hombre Grande, right? I think I mentioned it when I talked about that, right? They both live in the same place. They could tell you specifically on a map where it is, right? That story, that map, that geographical location, it's not just this thing that we're making up. This is something that's seen as evidence for the connection of the people to the land, and maybe over millennia. If you remember some of the maps that I brought up, we saw movement of people even from the 1800s, right? Another kind of thing that's demonstrating this link to territories. Language as well, right? So there's quite a bit, okay? Then think place names. There's a place name in one of the Mayagna territories, the fourth Mayagna territory. It's called Arunca in Mayagna. And there's a disagreement about the name. There's Españolina and Españolilna. One means the Spaniard that arrived and took care of everything. The other name means the Spaniard that showed up and got brutally murdered, right? Which do you think is the local term? Right, right. So we have place names that can even tell you incredible things on a map that we don't even think that this is going to be of value. No, when we collect it all together, it ends up bringing out the story of the people's connection to the land. Yes. With outsiders more, yeah? Yeah. Okay. So, and that's kind of an interesting term, right? So we've got the Miskitu, right? And we know that their origin came from Nigeria, right? In the 1500s, though. So, and we know that they intermix with the local population, and we know that under Nicaraguan law, they're termed as indigenous, sort of, right? So one of the land conflicts they sometimes can have is even with the Miskitu. So that would, for their group, be seen as an outsider, right? But as Pacific people, they might incorporate them both together as indigenous. So it's kind of a bit of perspective. All right. So links to territories and surrounding resources. A lot of this information is passed down from generation to generation as well. Distinct social, economic, and political systems. That means like different from other places, distinct. Okay, so when we look at our economy, for example, of the Mayagna, they have something that's called bidi bidi, and it means I help you if you help me. So when we did a lot of our research and tracking the economic system, they said, "Oh, but we can't forget bidi bidi." We said, "What do you mean bidi bidi?" Right? And interesting, the Miskitu had one called Pana Pana. So there was bidi bidi and Pana Pana, and it was their specific way of mutual assistance, kind of trade, right? Very specific to their group, very specific to their economics. Okay. And then the political system, right? We were just talking about the elders' councils. Distinct language, again, distinct to that specific place, right? So if we look at the Mayagna, we have the Bawichka dialect, the Panamachka dialect, sounds like Panama, right? Panamachka dialect. We have the Yuskul dialect, which everybody said was the lost tribe. They didn't even know they were still there, right? The Ulua and Tuaca dialects. So we have 5 dialects in a population of 40,000. That's pretty amazing, right? But unified as one Mayagna language, okay? Here's one of your problems. Form non-dominant groups of society. Looking at it, we might say, but that's not a real big problem. I mean, look at all the indigenous people. They're not dominant. They get like, that's why we call them a minority, right? Well, let's think it through. What's the goal for indigenous people for their rights? What is their goal? Is it just to get the land back? No. What else? What they want. Sovereignty, right? Okay. If you get sovereignty, are you considered dominant or non-dominant? Gives you a little bit of thinking there, right? So some indigenous groups, some Native American tribes, some Canadian tribes even, refuse to sign their own UN DRIP because it incorporates this idea. Say, this is our goal. Our goal is to be able to become dominant on our own lands, to be able to manage our own lands, to be sovereign on our own lands. How can you say that this no longer makes us indigenous, right? As if we lose the title by gaining the goal. Okay? How are we doing? All right. Almost. Right? Resolve to maintain. Okay. Got that. Right? That's your working definition for indigenous people. It came after we had a gentleman by the name of Martinez Cobo go all around the world. And he visited with like 150 different tribal groups, found that every single nation in the world had its own way of defining indigenous. Right? Nicaragua, if your group accepts you as part of the group, you're called indigenous. Strange way, I've been accepted by the Awastingni, I'm considered indigenous to Nicaragua. That doesn't make any sense to me. What? Same way as our country that says, oh, if you have 25 or 50%, depends on the blood rights, right? Then we'll call you indigenous. And yet we do the DNA test, that's not included, right? So we do have a world that is quite diverse on what each nation state will incorporate as indigenous or not, right? And yet we do have an attempt by the UN to make a working definition so that we can be addressing issues in different countries. Okay? Let's see. When we come back, we'll finish up recognition. There's pretty fascinating things about, even in the US, about recognition, not just about Native Hawaiians. Also taking away recognition, which we've done. And then taking a look at how we go about that process of making a report. I'll take you into the UN site. I'll take you where you make that incident report. We'll talk about Vicky, who's your reporter, right? And all those kinds of things, right? Okay. I'm in the middle of organizing about 10 to 15 different people to attend this year's UN meeting of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous People. I just registered like about 10 of them on Monday. So we're all going in as a group, and it's going to be an incredible meeting this year. So we'll get the chance to talk about that as well. Okay? Bye. Have a good day.